Well, good afternoon and good morning, good evening, depending on where you're located. Welcome to the CERC Migration event. Human mobility needs strategic planning, moving beyond populist exploitative migration policies, immigration policies. My name is Harold Bowder. I'm filling in for Anna Triandafilidou, who is the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration. And we are both professors at Ryerson University, which at this point, many faculty and students and staff are calling X-University because of the role that Egerton Ryerson, who gave the university its name, played in the design of residential schools in Canada. And as a result of this role, the university will soon change its name. So for now, we're calling it X-University, or the administration still suggests using Ryerson University. Toronto, where our university is located, is on traditional Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee territory, and it is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And according to this treaty, all settlers on the land and Indigenous nations have the responsibility to share the resources and the land collectively in friendship, in peace, and respect for one another. And I think especially on an event, for an event like this on immigration and migration, I think it's important to recognize that immigration, settlement, and Indigenous displacement and land appropriation and cultural and physical genocide have been very closely connected with each other, and they still are in the context of ongoing settler colonialism. Our event today will follow up on the 2018 Global Compact on Migration, which aims to facilitate human mobility and offer safe, affordable, and need-based migration options. But the work is just beginning, and today we will learn what states need to do to confront populist anti-immigration policies, to engage in strategic planning for migration, to invest in social integration, and to cooperate internationally. This event is funded by a connections grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And I'm going to hand it over to Greg Damian Smith, who is a senior research associate at CERC Migration, and who will now introduce the speakers. Greg?
Thank you very much for that, Harold. And just a quick note of thanks to Cynthia for the smooth operation of today's event. Today's event is the kickoff for a two-day book workshop that several of the participants here will be taking part in. Kiran and I are, along with Kiran Banerjee. Kiran is an assistant professor in political science at Dalhousie University and a Canada Research Chair in, excuse me for a second, Canada Research Chair in Forced Migration and Refugee Policy at Dal. The book that Kiran and I are co-editing is titled, tentatively titled, Understanding North American Migration Governance, Continuity and Change in Policies, Narratives, and Practices. I'm going to hand it over to Kiran now before formally introducing Francois for a special word.
Thank you, Craig. I should emphasize at the outset that we're very grateful for the integral role of the Canada Excellence Chair in Migration and Integration in supporting this initiative. I want to say that I'm immensely glad to be part of this event, but also deeply saddened that my colleague, mentor, and dear friend, Joseph Garcia, is not able to join us due to his tragic and untimely passing in November of 2020. Joseph was an organizer and original editor of this initiative and remains an integral part of the project. It was through innumerable conversations with Joe that the ideas that informed this event took concrete form, with his direct involvement continuing until just the month before his passing. I know that many in the audience knew Joseph, but I want to say some brief words about him, as the book project is in honor of him and will be dedicated to him. Joseph was born in the town of Satriano in the Calabria region of southern Italy. Although his subsequent scholarly and public policy contributions ranged across such areas as Canadian municipal policy, Indigenous politics, refugee resettlement, multiculturalism, and theorizing the nature of citizenship and diversity in Canada, Joseph's abiding and intense engagement with migration remained a constant throughout his academic career. Indeed, I see a clear line between Joseph's doctoral study, which he completed at Carleton University, on federal-provincial relations in immigration, emphasizing the role of asymmetric federalism, and his continued scholarship focused on understanding the complex, increasingly transnational dynamics of multi-level governance in migration policy, which was and is a focal point of this study and larger book project. During his time at the University of Saskatchewan, Joseph published prolifically, contributed his expertise to municipal, provincial, and federal governance, proved a paragon of university service, as well as mentored and supported both graduate students and early career faculty, such as myself. His commitment to teaching, reflected by the graduate students he directly supervised, and the additional 37 committees he served on, was marked by multiple awards for his teaching that he received, including one of the highest honors the University of Saskatchewan offers to faculty, the Master Teaching Award. I'm afraid that my brief remarks are incapable of doing justice to Joe, a great human being who enriched the lives of many through his kindness, generosity, thoughtfulness, and insight. I know that he's loved and very much missed by many people. And I also want to express my condolences to Joe's family on their profound loss. By way of conclusion, I should say that when Joe and I contacted Professor Crépeau about this project, he provided an immediate and enthusiastic reply, indicating his willingness to participate, and has remained a stalwart supporter of this project. Thank you, Francois. I know Joe would have been delighted to be here for your talk.
Thanks very much for that, Kiran. Okay, moving on with the event. I'm pretty honored to be able to introduce Professor Crépeau today. The last time you and I collaborated was when the Conservative Party of Canada was publishing and tweeting and talking some very deep misinformation about the Global Compact for Migration. And I'm looking forward to hearing how your thoughts have progressed on this since then. And just a quick word that Francois will be writing, I believe, the afterword or the postscript for the edited volume. Professor Crépeau, François Crépeau, is a full professor at the Hans and Tamar Oppenheimer and the Hans and Tamar Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law at the Faculty of Law at McGill University. His accolades are many and probably too many to mention here, but I'll just mention briefly that he's also an officer of the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. And very importantly, was also the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of migrants, on the human rights of migrants from 2011 to 2017, when I think that he came on, did very important work and came on a lot of people's radars internationally who weren't in the scholarly community or the legal community up until then. So without further ado, Francois, the floor is yours. The presentation will run 20 to 30 minutes-ish, and then we'll open the floor for questions directly written in the chat function on Zoom. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Craig. Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Harold, for inviting me. And I'm very honored to be, opening these days, this workshop in the memory of Joe Garcia. I will share my screen so we can start. So I suggested a long title. The idea is that before any progress can be made on migration policies, we will have to think those policies like we do for almost all other policies, i.e. For the next 20, 30, or 50 years. We do that for, no, I'll say it, but we do that for energy, for infrastructure, etc. And we'll need to do it for mobility, and we're not doing it at present. So let's start with a few things that many of you will know. I want to say hello here to the several people I've seen in the audience with whom I've worked, friends and colleagues. You know who you are, and I say hello. And you may have seen a few of these things that I'm going to say, but hopefully there will be new points as well. If I can move my, oh, here it is. So the first point is that I'm going to talk about migrants who are in a precarious situation, precarity being the key element here. I'm not really talking about those who are not called migrants, who are called expats, and who move around the world quite freely, have social capital, and are able to negotiate their conditions. I'm interested in the vast majority of migrant workers around the world and their families when they move with them, and these are called migrants, and they very frequently live in a precarious environment. We need to remember that if migrants come to host countries, they come because there is a labor market, an undocumented underground labor market, a temporary labor market, or a regular labor market for permanent residents, for example. But there has to be a labor market. Migrants are smart. They don't go to countries where there's no job to be had. They want to create a future for themselves and their families. Unfortunately, we have started in the beginning of the 80s to thicken our borders, and we have been able to create an industry for cheap labor. And several economic sectors now rely on cheap labor for their competitiveness. These sectors are sectors that we could not delocalize to countries with lower labor costs.
Sorry, Francois, I don't mean
yes.
to interrupt. Would you be able to make your presentation full screen?
Yes, thank you. I will do that.
Awesome.
I
Sorry
forgot.
about that. Thank you.
No. Here we are. Thank you for reminding me. I should know after 2 years of COVID. So these are sectors that are not that we can't delocalize. It's agriculture, care, construction, hospitality. It's well known that they exploit people and that these people are in great part migrants. And there's very little oversight, and labor law is ill-applied, not applied, misapplied. And this comes, and that's the point I want to make here, of a combination of migration policies and labor policies. We have migration policies, and I will show that in the next slides, which create a precarious status. And that precarious status means that migrants fear being returned home, and therefore they accept, often without protesting at all, labor conditions that we citizens or permanent residents would never accept. They're often, certainly in underground labor markets, well below the standards that are acceptable in this society. The employer has in his hands the life of the employee. By returning the migrant, the employer can destroy the life of the migrants, and the migrant needs this job because the migrant has come here very often by incurring debts to pay for recruitment fees, which are prohibited but still are very current, and to pay for travel and to pay for first needs in the country. And so they have a duty towards their family to send money home, to create a future of their kids, pay for school, pay for eventually medical care for their parents. They are bearers of family duties. They need to succeed, and they will accept because of that labor conditions that we wouldn't accept. And this migrant precarity is policy induced. It's a strategy to reduce labor costs. It probably wasn't a strategy at the beginning. I would say at the beginning of the 80s, it wasn't a strategy. It came when we thickened the borders, and suddenly moving around was made much more difficult than it was in the 60s or early 70s. So one thing we have done is that we have criminalized undocumented migration. We know that we need low-wage migrants in the farms, in the hospitals, in the old age care homes, in restaurants, in hotels. We know that. And yet we've heard the Premier of Quebec, Mr. Legault, say that he didn't want any immigrant earning a salary of less than $53,000 because that would reduce the mean salary in Quebec. I mean, this is language, and we'll see why this language exists, but we know we need them, and we still block low-wage migrants. We don't provide visas to low-wage migrants. And therefore, we will create and subsidize an underground market. Because if governments do not provide the type of labor that employers need and employers call for, well, other people will provide them. And we know that. This is documented. We've been writing on this for decades. And so we are creating, entrenching, and subsidizing underground markets. Smuggling market for sure, but also unscrupulous recruiters, employers, greedy lodgers, loan sharks, etc. So that's one side. The other side is that we've created precarity in the temporary labor migration programs with a precarious status, often with a single employer. It exists, for example, in the Middle East, the kafala system. It exists in Canada, the sponsorship system. And we know that in these temporary labor migration programs, again, oversight is minimal. And we hear, for example, every summer about horror stories on our farms. In both cases, for undocumented migration or for temporary migration, labor inspections are mostly absent. Unionization is discouraged or prohibited. Protesting is punished. You're either blacklisted or you're returned home. And therefore, migrants do not benefit from the guarantees of labor law. This is all organized within irresponsible political discourses. And I say irresponsible, not meaning that all politicians are irresponsible, but meaning that there's no political responsibility for what we say, for what politicians say on migration. Because electoral democracy, which remains the best system we've ever invented to govern ourselves, does not represent migrants. They do not vote. They are not elected. They do not participate in public debates because of the fear of being detected, detained, deported. And therefore, migration policies are made by non-migrants, the politicians, for non-migrants, their electorate. The electorate is the aim, the basic aim of migration policies. The electorate has to be happy with the migration policies. Now, neither migrants, neither politicians, nor the electorate are migrants in most cases. We have to relativize that. They don't know what they're talking about. They have no knowledge of the reality. And the migrants are not invited to the public debates. I'm thinking here of the migrants without social capital, those who are in precarious situation. And they don't bring to the debate the reality check of their own stories. And therefore, we have policies which are made exactly like when policies about women were made by committees of men. They are based on fantasies, stereotypes. This is constructed. For example, we hear all the time that migrants are responsible for unemployment of Canadians or whatever country we are in, responsible for crime, responsible for illnesses, responsible for insecurity. And this goes uncontradicted because the only politically mobilizable electorate is the anti-immigration electorate. People who, like me are in favor of migration, we usually don't vote on migration issues because it doesn't concern us. We'll vote on tax issues, on school issues, on hospital issues, but not on migration issues, most of us. And also, since the beginning of the 80s, and certainly since 9/11, we have sort of a permanent crisis at the border due to migration. It's true in the Mediterranean for Europe. It's true in the southern border of the US. You know, and many countries are starting to build walls, have built walls between India and Bangladesh. There's a wall, etc. So there's a permanent crisis, and permanent crisis is an opportunity for politicians, certainly in electoral cycles. We use what I call liquid language. You see the examples on the slide. This liquid language means that we consider migrants as a group, as a mass. There's no individuality. All migrants are the same. Migrants are like this. We used to do that for women. We used to do that, you know, in the 30s in Europe for Jews. We used to do that for many groups in society who were, you know, whose rights were not protected. We've been doing that in the past, and we're still doing it for migrants. Migrants are. That's what we say. We don't consider that Joe might be different or that Adele could be this way. No, migrants are like this. We use also in migration, when we talk about migration, and certainly in migration policies, we have included now criminal law, language, but also standards, institutions, when immigration law is administrative law. And the problem we have is that today, the only judge in Canada, for example, who can send people to extrajudicial executions, torture, and arbitrary detention is the immigration judge. Not on purpose, but that's the only judge. Administrative law, which has not grown the guarantees of criminal law because it was not dangerous. It was the law of, you know, construction permits and zoning licenses and things like that. Well, the most dangerous law of the land today is immigration law, and it doesn't have the guarantees of criminal law, the procedural guarantees, the evidentiary guarantees. So this anti-immigration political discourse has two purposes: mobilize an electorate and justify repressive policies towards migration. Yet, migration is in the DNA of mankind. It's a normal coping mechanism. That's what we've done for eons. You know, we've been on this earth as sapiens sapiens probably 300,000 years, and we've always moved. It's part of our DNA. It's part of who we are. And the migration pressure will not stop. The migration pressure will remain. Yet, the more we repress and disempower the migrants, the more we empower the criminals exploiting their precarity. And then we have to spend money fighting this criminality. Just like we've had, you know, anyway, I'll come to that. The human cost is indecent. Lives lost, childhood destroyed. The financial costs are indecent. For the migrants who have to work for 3 or 4 years. I've met workers in Qatar who've worked for 3 years to reimburse their debts before sending the first cent to their family. But also for societies, everything that we do to prevent migration, everything, you know, radar surveillance, drones, all this, you know, returns, detention, all this costs a fortune. And yet we have another way to do this, and it's been outlined. And it's not, you know, the wet dream of a professor or of an NGO. It's been negotiated by states and approved by 153 member states of the UN General Assembly. Now, it was negotiated by civil servants and diplomats in consultation with experts and international organizations and civil society organizations and academics, people who knew what they were talking about. It was very smartly, the whole negotiation was very smartly organized by the two co-presidents, Ambassador Gomez Camacho of Mexico, Ambassador Lauber of Switzerland, and with the help of Madame Arbour of Canada, who was the special representative of the Secretary General. It was smart of them to do it the way they did because they excluded mostly politicians from the debate. Politicians reacted very late, and realizing very late, that's when we had the meeting with Craig, realizing in November, when the text of the Global Compact had been determined in July 2018, realizing in November that it was going to be signed, and then some politicians reacted. But it provides us with a conceptual framework, a roadmap for what states should do. And unfortunately, it's the opposite of what most states are doing. And so we cannot expect that there will be short-term consequences, short-term implementation. I will compare this with the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It took 18 years to get to the covenants, and another 18 years to get to the Convention Against Torture, and another 5 years to get to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and then another, I don't remember, 17 years, I think, to get to the Convention on Persons with Disabilities. It's a long process, and I think it's going to be a long process for the Global Compact, which has the same non-binding value as the Universal Declaration. Now, the central issue, the central word that the Global Compact utilizes is facilitating. Facilitation. It's used 62 times in the English negotiated text, and it's not happenstance. Most states have insisted on some kind of repression, and 3 of the goals, you see them here, 3 of the goals are going towards that. States will still need repression at their borders for a number of activities. However, most commitments aim at reducing the repression, reducing the precarity, and facilitating the mobility. And I list here a few, and we'll go through them. You can read that afterwards anyway, but creating pathways for regular migration. We've been asking for that for at least 2 decades. States are still restricting access, and especially for low-wage migrants, to their territory. Facilitate family reunification. Well, you know, they talk about a right to family life in the Global Compact. Well, we should say that, we should tell that to all the temporary migrant workers around the world who cannot bring by law their family to their work, to the place where they work. Guarantee ethical recruitment, decent work. This means applying labor law. The labor codes in most countries, including those who are, you know, the worst for their workers, usually the labor codes are not that bad, but they're not applied. Labor inspections are useless. Facilitate change of employer, transition between statuses. In most countries, it takes months to change an immigration status or change workplace with the permission of the government. Facilitate regularization of status. So the word regularization has disappeared from the Global Compact's official text because states didn't want to see it, but the paragraph has stayed. And, you know, when we have hundreds of thousands or millions of undocumented migrants, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. These people are working, but they're not contributing to the society as much as they could. And still they're working here, they're living here, sometimes for years, they're part of the society, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot by not regularizing them. Here it says, facilitate regularization, and yet states don't want to do that. Include migrants in crisis preparedness. Prepare for crises. Don't be surprised if people come to your borders if there is a crisis somewhere. This is what everybody has done for centuries. So let's get ourselves ready. We do emergency preparedness for forest fires, for earthquakes, for floods. We could do it for you know, political crises. Use immigration detention as a measure of last resort and work towards alternatives. There are alternatives in the criminal law system. There are no alternatives in most immigration detention systems because it doesn't pay for politicians it doesn't bring any rewards for politicians to invest money in alternatives for detention. Detention brings votes. Having alternatives for detention doesn't. Ensure that all migrants have access, regardless of their migration status, that's the wording, have access to basic services. And there's a paragraph for firewalls, preventing public services from informing immigration enforcement that someone presented themselves with an irregular status. Empowering migrants. That's the first time I see in an official document the words empowering and migrants next to one another. That's the only thing that ever worked. It's by empowering women, and women empowered themselves quite a lot, but by being empowered through the right to vote, but also through mobilizing, unionizing, making claims, and publicly claiming their rights. That's how women, indigenous peoples, the LGBTQ plus community, detainees have been able to claim their rights and have pushed back against the restrictions that were enforced upon them. Promote an open public discourse, constructive perception of migration, facilitate recognition of skills. We've been asking that for so long. Now, the Global Compact is not perfect, and I'll list here a number of issues that are missing. For example, access to justice, accountability. It's not there really for migrants. Child detention is not prohibited. We're going to work to end the practice of child detention. How long is it going to take, etc. No mention of the fact that exploitative labor markets in host countries are a pull factor of migration. We always accuse the migrants of coming. We're never accusing the employers of pulling them in. And yet, this is not mentioned at all in the Global Compact. But we have now a roadmap. So the problem is that we cannot do that overnight. We have whole sectors that rely on cheap labor. Facilitating mobility overnight would mean the collapse of Canadian agriculture. We need to do for mobility, integration, diversity policies what we do for all other government policies. Long-term strategic planning, 20, 30, 50 years. It has to be sustainable development. Policies need to be inclusive, integrated, resilient, transversal. And we need to have a debate about those policies, a public discussion with all the voices coming at the table, not only the department, the Ministry of, the Department of Immigration here, or the Department of Home Affairs, or the Department of Interior, but all ministers, but also all voices, including the migrants themselves, so that they bring the reality check of their lived lives to the debate. And we need more fluid border crossings. More migrants, we need to allow more migrants to come and look for work. What we do between Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, we should be able to, and what Europeans do between Warsaw, Paris, and Madrid, we should be able to do across the globe. Allow people to come and look for work. If they find work, they will stay and an employer will be happy. And with status, they'll be able to claim their rights and protest. And if they don't find a job, in most cases, they will go away. In most cases, people don't want to stay without a job in a place. What's happened in the US with the closing or the thickening of the borders in the 80s, is that people feared going back to Mexico for fear of not being able to come back to the US. And so they stayed, even unemployed, until they found another job. But we don't need that type of mechanism. We need to develop visa facilitation, liberalization regimes, aim at an open and regulated movement. But we need to understand that employers and potential employees will have to find each other, and we can put together tools like we've done for our citizens. We can put together tools to allow that. The ultimate objective is to make mobility easier, safer, cheaper, and faster for everyone. This is exactly what all those free movement zones are doing in Europe, in Africa, ECOWAS, in South America, the Southern Cone. We should have done that with NAFTA long ago, and it's not happened. We need certainly to govern mobility, which means allow it, regulate it, and taxing it. Key condition, we need to take all migrants out of the underground, and we need to apply labor law to all workers. We need to implement labor inspections, employ sanctions. We need to integrate migrants in order to empower them. That's what the Global Compact says, and facilitate access to permanent residence and nationality. Now, no country can do this alone. If one country opens their borders, well, there will be an influx of, and you see, I'm using myself liquid language. There will be a movement to that country because their borders are more open. They may offer more jobs, etc. So we need common approaches, probably at regional level at first. And we need to discuss between states what we need to do in terms of labor needs, visa categories, emergency response, etc. At regional level, it would help free movement zones, field recognition, and that will help us avoid crisis and share responsibilities. And we need to reduce this idea of zero tolerance policies about migrants by harm reduction policies. We did that for alcohol and drugs. We created a whole category of criminality around drugs. Now that we have legalized cannabis, now that we have a Société Québécoise du Cannabis that sells cannabis like alcohol is sold at the Société des Alcools, we are slowly reducing the criminal market for that. It'll take time, but that happens. It's harm reduction. We can do that for migration. It would reduce the pressure on refugee determination systems because many people who are probably at the same time in need of a job and in need of protection are asking for protection when they could have had a work permit instead. Many people before the 80s came to Europe, came to North America in need of protection, but got a work permit. Didn't need to ask for the refugee determination system to vet them. They just asked for a work permit and they got it. It would reduce the power of criminal networks. The more you prohibit, the more the criminals are enjoying the underground. I mean, we've seen that with alcohol, we've seen that with drugs, we're seeing this with many of the ills of our societies. And it would enhance the capacity of border control because people would go to the border guard to have their papers controlled. And this is not science fiction. This is how it was in the 50s, 60s, and most of the 70s. People could enter countries easily, ask for a job, and if they found a job, they could ask for a work permit and got it quite quickly. In conclusion, it's the opposite of what states are doing now. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. I fear that my generation is incapable of envisaging that. And I hope that the generation of my children who are in their 30s now and who will be in power in 10, 20 years will be able, with the kind of education they've received, at least in cities, with the multicultural side of cities and of most cities in many parts of the world, they will be able to bring a different perception of migration to migration policy making. And hopefully they will be able to do that. But I think that the first step has been done with the Global Compact. It initiates conversations between actors, and hopefully, like the Universal Declaration, it will create a culture of human security for all migrants, like the Universal Declaration created a culture of human rights over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Francois, and for ending on a somewhat optimistic note. We have several comments and questions coming through, which I'll relate to you, but I'm going to take my prerogative as chair to ask you a speculative question. In Canada, this distinction between kind of the control and management is coming to something of a head, given that the Supreme Court of Canada will will make a judgment on the constitutionality of the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States. And I wanted to ask you if you could comment on that briefly, given your expertise and potentially inside legal knowledge, specifically because the government of Canada, the federal government, has been talking for some years now about, quote, modernizing the agreement, which very likely just means more border controls. And I'm wondering if you could connect that back to your comments on the very significant costs of pushbacks and control and detention.
Yes. One question of semantic first. You have control and management, but normally when we talk of people, we talk about governance. Why are we managing migrants like we're managing parcels? We should be governing migration, and very few states are using actually this language, and I find that interesting. And that means that, I have no specific knowledge on what the Supreme Court is going to do. I have the same knowledge as you about the Safe Third Country Agreement and what Canada wants to do with it. We know that they would like to expand, along the border, coast to coast. I think that, to me, it's regrettable. It's regrettable because it increases, first of all, the cost for the migrants. We've had people die on our borders. This was not the case before. And now we have people dying on our borders, and that should not be an achievement. The fact that the European Union is, keeping their system when several thousand people die in the Mediterranean every year because of it, is, to me, something that is unacceptable, and it's the same for the Arizona desert and many other places around the world. We're not the only ones. So there's something here that needs to change. I would argue that, someone said in the chat, I was looking quickly at the chat, there are many places where freedom of movement across borders has been instituted on a bilateral level or regional level. And I think that's what needs to be done. That we need to start with that. We need to start with, agreement with our neighbors that our citizens can cross the border and look for work. That would simplify, considerably. Let's start with simple things, as if an agreement between Canada and the US, or Canada, US, Mexico, to allow the citizens of the three countries to cross borders easily and seek jobs was simple. No, it's not simple, but it's simpler than trying to have a world, treaty on freedom of movement. So I think that would be the objective. I haven't heard any person in charge of, in governments, neither in Mexico nor in the US nor in Canada, uttering any idea like this. And so it's not going to happen anytime soon. I fear that for the moment, my generation is stuck on a nationalist vision of us and them, and will not let that go. Hopefully, my children will think otherwise.
Thank you. There's two questions that I'm going to bundle together, pushing back somewhat on your analysis and asking about a thread of analysis about racial justice. Specifically, given that the majority of people who are securitized, to use the academic language, are also racialized. And another question asking more about the role of race in the delineation of migration policies, specifically asking about Canada, given that also most of the people who are streamed into temporary foreign worker programs, whether that's in agriculture or personal care, are also racialized. And then potentially building on that, the subsequent questions around the mobilization of anti-immigrant policies, or the mobilization of, crises for electoral gain.
What's the question about the mobilization?
The question was about the evidence around it, but it strikes me that that what evidence is there that anti-immigrant discourse or policies gain votes? But it strikes me that there's significant overlap with the questions about racialization and racial justice there.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah, we are in an us and them rhetorical game here. We are creating anxiety. The objective of this nationalist populist discourse, we can qualify it differently and depending on the political context in different countries, but the idea is to create an anxiety about another group. That other group might in the past have been inside the country, that other group might be outside the country, that other group might be a minority, might be etc. But there's always a difference, a religious difference, an ethnic difference, and there's a difference, and that difference is. So in the case of migrants, as was mentioned, most migrants who are in the temporary work programs, temporary labor programs that we have instituted in Canada, but that's true elsewhere as well, come from the South. In the agriculture, it's clear. In domestic services, it's clear. They come from the South, and therefore they are minoritized in our countries. They are, they are deemed to be less worthy of our attention because they come from the South and they only stay for a few, for some time, and then they go back home. That's how it's supposed to be. And they are mostly out of sight, domestic workers, for example, who are in caregivers in houses, in households, or in institutions. We don't see them much. They are out of the view. Agricultural workers are in the countryside and on a farm, often far from the road, in the field. These are people we don't see quite often, and that's a way of making sure that they stay quiet, and we want them quiet. And to me, the racialization of these migrants, the emphasis on the racial characteristics of these migrants is a rhetorical tool. We emphasize that. We create anxiety about the difference between us and them. We impute to them a number of threats, dangers, so that the majority population will approve a number of restrictive policies towards them. I mean, you can see this in many countries. Canada is probably not the worst of all countries in that sense. If you look in Europe, if you look south of the border, if you look around the world, in South Africa, in Malaysia, some of the treatment of the migrants in Thailand is horrendous. But yet the pattern is quite similar everywhere, even if the consequences may not be.
Thank you for that. There was also a couple of questions which I'll bundle together about the global compact itself. One question asking quite simply, 3 years on since the adoption as in the General Assembly, the progress on its implementation, and other questions asking about the role of high-skilled labor mobility, given that you focused more on precarious immigrants in your talk, and whether or not the kind of tensions between the GCM and facilitating and the rather strict criteria for high-skilled labor mobility. Whether or not, and the question directly is whether or not those criteria would also be considered control measures.
Mm-hmm. Implementation progress after 4 years. There will be the first review conference in June. Is it May or June? May, June, early summer. It will be every 4 years, and the first one is this year after 4 years, 3.5 years, more precisely. My estimation of the progress is that the talk about migration policies is being slowly structured. Now, I don't think any migrant has seen any progress in their condition because of the Global Compact as of now. I may be wrong. Maybe there are some here and there who have maybe, I haven't seen policies that have changed, national policies that have changed significantly because of the Global Compact. What is progressing, I think, is first of all, dialogues between operators, between stakeholders. So I think civil society is much more linked to international organizations. Civil society, for example, unions have been playing a better role in the past 3 years. Unions have often been silent on the migration policy issues, often, not always, but often, because their own members were wary of the competition by migrants, and they had, in many cases, unions were not investing in the migrants, in migrant workers, especially not undocumented migrant workers. I think it's changing. For example, in the US, certainly agricultural worker unions are now investing in enlisting agricultural workers, documented or not. Why? Because there are not that many American citizens who are working in the field. So it's all about migrants. And that means that the unions, in order to survive, have to suddenly realize that these workers are in the exact position of the industrial workers for whom unions were invented, or through whom unions were invented at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It's the exact same ecological niche, if I can say. And that unions are slowly realizing it. It's more difficult in construction or in hospitality, but I think it's gaining ground, and certainly they're more interested, certainly at international level, they're interested in the discussion. So I think the discussions are progressing. Stakeholders are talking to each other, exchanging, the buzzwords, lessons learned and good practices, etc. States are interested. And when I say states, I'm not talking about the politicians. I'm talking the persons who are in these meetings, who are high-level civil servants, diplomats. They are much more knowledgeable about migration policies than we think, and they are in discussion with union leaders, with civil society organizers, with international organizations, and that creates a common culture. It's going to be slow. That's what I was saying in the presentation. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time because we have, first of all, to create some form of common platform in terms of how we analyze the situation, and that might take, a decade or more. And then we will be able to bring that back in our societies and start making changes with the politicians, convince the politicians that it is in their interest to do that. And it will take time. I think Canada can be a champion of that type of evolution. If we participate, and Canada has defined itself as one of the champion countries in the implementation of the Global Compact. So hopefully these dialogues that are starting now will lead somewhere. But, I don't have any crystal ball. I had, the high-skill mobility, I forgot about that one. High-skill mobility. High-skill mobility is interesting because it is subject to a number of restrictions, but it is courted by most governments. Most governments are looking for high-skilled migrants in fields where they can't produce enough graduates. In Canada, we know, for example, in Montreal, we're lacking the IT people, and especially those who are in the video game industry, etc. And so we're looking for them, and we need them. I heard the Premier of Quebec recently saying that he wanted to hire 10,000 nurses abroad. Well, well, I won't comment on the state of our healthcare system. These are considered highly skilled, and normally they face a number of conditions in order to enter in states. They may still be in a precarious situation, but they have social capital. And being high skilled, they are courted elsewhere and they can move. Now, doesn't mean that their situation, their legal status is less precarious. For example, in the Gulf countries, the Nepali construction worker and the Canadian IT engineer have the exact same one-year work permit for one employer, renewable. So in terms of legal status, it's the same precarity, except that the Canadian IT engineer can move tomorrow to Singapore or to Rio de Janeiro if there is a business willing to employ them. That's not the case of the Nepali construction worker, and the Nepali construction worker has debts to pay that will take him, in the case of a construction worker, years to pay. And that's true for the Filipino nanny as well, who has also incurred costs in order to come. High-skilled migrants usually have social capital. They have savings. They have a home base which can welcome them back, and they can move on. So despite the fact that they are facing conditions, it's not free movement, they can move quite easily. There are exceptions. There are cases where they find themselves in dire situations, but it's not the vast majority, contrary to the case of low-wage migrants, which, by the way, might be very skilled. I hope that we don't consider a nanny for our children or for our parents to be unskilled, because I'd be afraid to put my kid or my mother into their hands if they were unskilled.
I like your point there. This is something I've been pushing on for a while, talking about the difference between low wage and low rights, and then low skilled. They're not the same thing at all. We only have a couple more minutes left. There was a question from Ray regarding this recommendation to look strategically at labor and migration policies in tandem, which builds off your last points. And I thought perhaps we could just end there. You made a comment that said it would help take all migrants from the underground economy. So, in a couple of minutes, if you could answer Ray's questions. Basically, what is the labor policy strategy to end unauthorized or unregulated work?
Thank you, Ray, for the question. To me, the two are the migration policies and labor policies are what create this precarity bubble. The fact that at the same time we put the fear into the hearts of migrants because they can be sent back home empty-handed at any time, and we don't apply labor law. So what needs to be done is to reduce the precarity of migrants. For example, that's all in the Global Compact. Allow them to change employer, by their own means. Don't ask them to ask permission of the employer to change employer, or don't ask them to ask the government to give them permission, and it will take 6 or 8 months, during which they continue to be exploited or during which they are undocumented. Allow them to change employer like you and I can change employer. If they find something, they can change employer overnight. Give them this, power. And it's in the Global Compact, we need to empower them like we are empowered to change employer. Just by doing this, we will free a lot of people who are stuck in a situation where they're exploited. So that's one thing, and it's linked to the immigration status. But if we also applied labor law, if we had better labor inspections, if we didn't discourage unions, for example, in Canada, as you may know, agricultural workers in Quebec and Ontario are prohibited from unionizing. Well, that doesn't empower them for sure. That reduces them to silence, and they cannot negotiate when they should be negotiating. And that would create a situation where we citizens, we would have to realize that the food we're eating comes at a cost, and that this cost, we need to be able to pay it. And that means probably changing the way agriculture is done. We know that there is more and more mechanized agriculture in greenhouses, etc. These are good things. It's progress. It means less employment by agricultural workers because it's more mechanized, but it also means that there's less exploitation. And this is something that needs to be developed. We need to talk about it as not only technical progress, but also reduction of exploitation. And we need to do it on the immigration front and on the labor law front.
On that note, I think that we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank you first, Francois, for taking the time to be here and to give this talk. Thanks also to the entire team at the CERC at Ryerson, especially Sinthu, Grace, and Laura, whose hard work behind the scenes always makes us look good, but they don't get recognized enough. Thanks to Harold for taking the time to be here to take care of the important line acknowledgement for us and introduce us. For those of you who are in the book workshop, please take 5, and then we'll see you on the other Zoom link that we emailed out. And thanks to everyone in the audience for being here and for your questions.